Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm back to making more videos regularly now, I guess. And a very interesting update came out today as I was scrolling through Twitter by NextJS. NextJS 15's release candidate is out, so I just wanted to get on and make a video very quickly about it. So, yep, that's here. It's a big update because next year's, I mean, it's not a big update in the sense that a lot of things are changing, like in maybe something like next year's 13, the amount of things were changed. But it's definitely, I guess, a more major impact than next year's 14. Um, which almost seemed like a minor update. But yeah, so if you look at the tweet which came out, Next.js 15 RC, they've just basically working with React 19 Canary, React compiler support. We'll talk more about that in detail right now. But yeah, it's a pretty good update and it's being taken very well by the community, as you can see. So yeah, let's start off. I'm just going to go what changed. First thing, for people who know 19 Canary releases, in the sense that they are allowing that release to be available to frameworks so that it can be integrated into their frameworks to, utilize the new features like form actions. Most of these were already being used by Next.js before, but I think it's more stable release kind of. You can take a deeper look into what React 19 has changed by looking into this, but that's a whole separate video if I won't take too long if I get into this. But yeah, that's one of the big updates. They're including React 19 into this. Second one, React compiler. React compiler for a few days back in the React um, the meet which happened, they announced the React compiler, and it's been in development for a long time. I think Meta has already included that in a lot of lot of their Instagram pages, for example, and it's been working well. But they don't, but I think the point is that they don't right now recommend people to use it unless you're very sure about it. Uh, but it's a step in a good direction because it basically they talk about the rules of React and how the React compiler knows about it a lot more. And if you look at, for example, Theo's video on it, he talks about how even the Meta developers or the React developers, they figured out more about, the rules of React by working on the React compiler. So that's an important thing to note, and I feel like it's a huge step going forward, and it's a very interesting update. Just to give a in a nutshell, React compiler does a lot of compilation behind the hood, in the sense that you don't have to use memo and use callback manually as much as we were using before, and it kind of makes it easier for new developers to pick up React, because these ideas was something which even for me, it took a while to wrap my head around, and even now I'm not sure if I'm completely 100% comfortable with memorization and callbacks. And it's something which is very interesting, and I hope a lot of developers pick up React after this comes out. So yeah, React compiler, you can use that now, and you need to install the Babel plugin React compiler. It's not available directly in React 19 yet. And then you install that and then set that in your next config to be experimental. You can also you configure the compiler to run opt-in by using a compilation. Yeah, look at this link. Hydration elements. Hydration, I think Next.js 14 already did a good job uh, in the sense of hydration errors, because before that it used to be very vague about what is going wrong. I think they made it much better in terms of the stack trace which comes out. You can see where the issue is happening now. um, but I think there adding much more like deeper details about what the error might be, which is pretty good because hydration errors are something which can be very annoying, and it might take a while for people to, understand where the code is going wrong. And then in the end, mostly we just end up disabling the or suppressing the hydration, whatever that attribute is inside the root. But yeah, that's a good update in my opinion, and I think provides a deeper understanding on what the errors might be in hydration. Caching updates. This is the most important one in my opinion here, because even yesterday, a friend of mine, someone who was looking through the Next.js, the app router docs for the first time, they said something about how caching is so complicated in Next.js that it can be a handful, and and it used to be very annoying to me that the fetch, most of the requests were like by default cached, and it in a lot of times it just takes a while to understand what's going wrong in the application, and then you figure out the cache was enabled. Um, so the major update here is that fetch requests get route handlers, and the client router is no longer cached by default. It's uncached. For example, if you use the fetch request, Next.js uses web fetch API. Now I think they had their own fetch. They went back to using the web fetch API, and by default it's no store now. It used to be force cache, which was very weird because you ideally as a developer don't want caching to be enabled by default. I'm not sure what the ideology behind that was, and now they've just changed it to no store, and you need to set force cache if you want it to be cached, which in my opinion is more, intuitive. Yep, so that's that. You can look into more about the caching options. There are a bunch of them, which again, I'm not a fan of because there are way too many caching options in my opinion, but there are use cases for each and every one of them. That's why it's there. So yeah, take a look at them. Hopefully, you find it easier to understand than I did when I was looking at the caching docs. Get route handlers are also no longer cached by default. They used to, you basically said that export dynamic. I'm not sure what the attribute was before. I think it was something about dynamic, but you had to set it manually for it to not be cached, and that's pretty cool that these are not cached. And it also I didn't read this, but special route handlers like sitemap, etc remain static by default unless they use dynamic functions. This is interesting. I think this makes sense because you want ideally for these files and these images to be cached by default, because they don't change very often. Almost never change. So yep, that's a very nice addition to that. Client router cache is also no longer caches page components by default. Okay, I actually don't honestly don't remember stale times flag. Let me just look at that. Maybe gives a better idea. Oh, it's caching with page segments separately. Interesting. Uh, so stale times is an experimental feature that enables caching of page segments in the client-side router cache. You can enable this experimental feature, and I think it's more related to the client components and how the router caching was working over there. You could set stale times for that. For dynamic pages you want it to be 30 seconds, and static pages you want to be 180 seconds or something like that. By default dynamic has 0. Obviously you want it to fetch every time, and then for static pages you want it to be. Oh, it's actually for different properties. Dynamic property is used when the prefetch prop on link is left unspecified. And when the link has a prefetch of true, you want it to be the static, and that's fetched every 5 minutes by default, and you can change that. That's interesting. I actually didn't look at that before. That's something I might be using more now that I've looked at those talks. In Next.js 15, this flag still remains accessible, but we're changing the default behavior to have a stale time of 0 for page segments. I think they had a stale time for that for page segments, and they are changing it back to no cache by default. So basically what Next.js is doing is just going back and then saying everything is not cache by default. Choose what you want to be cache, and I feel that's more intuitive for as a developer. This is a very important update, in my opinion. um, okay, it also says that these remain unchanged. Shared layout data won't be refetched. Makes sense, you don't want that to be refetched every single time. Partial rendering is something we'll talk about next. Back forward navigation will still restore from cache. Makes sense. Uh, it's basically to ensure that browser can restore scroll position. Basically, when you click on this, right? Click on these two buttons over here. They basically have the idea that you go back or front, and what Next.js basically does is that it restores the scroll position of that page, which is pretty cool. Loading JS will remain cached for 5 minutes. Makes sense. Your loading pages don't almost never change. They're most of the times not dynamic, so it makes sense that it's cached as well. So they've made sense as to what should be cached and what should not be cached now, and that's pretty cool. Incremental adoption of partial pre-rendering (PPR). They introduced this in Next.js 14. I hadn't read too much about it this before this, but ideally, I mean, what partial pre-rendering does is, for example, in a page like this, the suspense fallback, right? That is pre-rendered because the fallback is constant despite what the dynamic component might be, and the static component is also static. So these static components are pre-rendered onto the page. Note that this is a server component, and the dynamic component comes in afterwards. So these are immediately put into the HTML and shown onto the screen or onto the browser on first load. So that's cool. I think they are allowing incremental adoption now. It combines static and dynamic rendering, that's what I said. And Next.js currently defaults to static rendering unless you use dynamic functions such as cookies, headers, and uncached data requests. Um, you basically, that's what I talked about. You can wrap any dynamic UI in a suspense boundary, and this thing is static, and this one is dynamic. Pretty cool. Will immediately serve a static HTML shell. Yep, that's what I covered. Um, yeah, to use that, you'll have play around with PR, see how that works. Next after is an interesting update. I don't exactly know a use case for it in my applications yet, but they have talked about a use case here. Basically, it's basically a function which you can use to run something after all the main function has returned. Um, they are it's different to await in the sense that it's not related to whatever is happening before, so you don't want it to be blocked by that in the event loop. And await or asynchronous functions, they basically, when you await something, it basically waits for the previous function to complete, and it's blocked by that in the event loop. It's a whole lot of JavaScript jargon, but basically what after does is, it's not blocked by that, but it's a secondary task which runs after the primary task, and then you can just use it to maybe log something or run it as a middleware. Not a middleware because it's running after whatever is happening, but yep, you can do logging, analytics, and some system synchronization which you want. Pretty cool. I'm not sure if I know a use case just yet, but they have put in some interesting use cases over here. Um, so yeah, this is what I was talking about. These tasks are not directly related to the response, so users should not have to wait for them to complete. Now, deferring the work after responding to the user poses a challenge because serverless functions stop computation immediately after a response is closed. Yeah, so this makes sense mostly for serverless functions because the moment that the response comes back in terms of return, returning from a function, the functions just close. I think it makes sense because if you're deploying on something like Vercel, they mostly run these as serverless functions. Yep, that's mostly related to the code. One interesting update they've done is change the design. I think this was more related to, I think I saw a tweet a few days back. I don't remember who put it up, but they were talking about how feedback on if Next.js should go back to a much more basic web page, or a starter template, just to be able to easily be able to change whatever is on that. I think it's in my opinion, that's a good step because you want to be able to change things very simply. Else before you had to go change all the styles, take out all the boilerplate code and then start off. But I think it's a little easier now. Not too big of a deal, but it's an update which is there. When running create next app, now it asks you if you want to enable TurboPack for local development. By default, it's no because it's still not exactly stable. Uh, but it's something you can use and check out. There are still a few issues which come up when you use TurboPack in sense of external packages and all that, but it's getting to a stage where it's pretty much usable. So yeah. And then Dasher Turbo can also be used to enable TurboPack. And to make getting started on a new project even easier, new dash empty flag has been released, which results in a minimal hello world page. That is cool. None of the extraneous files and styles. This is nice. This is something I really wanted in Next.js because most of the times I don't want the boilerplate which is coming with it. I think this is very cool. This is a good update in my opinion. Optimizing bundling of external packages. The problem, if you have used Next.js, it's improved a lot. But what used to happen was if you're using some packages like, icons, React icons, for example, it Next.js basically bundles all that code as well. And what happens was the cold starts because of it, and the hot reload which was happening, it used to take a very, very long time. I have had applications where it used to take like half a minute to load some pages, which is not ideal. And I think they've basically optimized that bundling. This is more of a performance improvement, nothing related to what you have to do. But basically in the pages router, external packages are not bundled by default, but you can provide a list of packages to bundle using transfile packages. Now, to unify, oh, in the app router, external packages are bundled by default, and you can opt out now. This is what I was talking about. You can opt out from them. Now, to unify configuration between app and pages, we're introducing a new option: bundle pages router dependencies. If you set that to true, it matches whatever is happening in the app router. If you're using only the app router, this is not very useful to you, but it's something which can be used by people who are moving incrementally from the pages to the app router. And then you can then use server external packages to opt out from specific packages, whatever packages you need to opt out from. That's most of the major changes which are happening in Next.js 15 RC. Other changes include, changing 19 RC. The exactly comes to my head. Oh, again, packages. You need to but anything outside of the Next.js time, some file, or you can use something use and all dot to form actions and using so damn raw implementation of this. Interesting. Oh, use form state and all that. I haven't looked at these talks and all that. Yep, that's it on X15 RC. I think some very interesting updates with the new dependencies, and take a look. And that's it for this video. More videos coming very soon. I'm going to be much more regular now and be posting like small videos